Hey everyone. There's a piece of misinformation involving Dr. Fauci and the CDC that has been going around for a long time now. It seems that many people are under the impression that Dr. Fauci and the CDC lied to the public about mask efficacy in order to preserve mask supplies, all without telling the public. Obviously, this has been spread by people who have an axe to grind against Dr. Fauci, the CDC, and COVID lockdowns in general, i.e. conspiracy-minded or right-leaning commentators. What makes this piece of misinformation so insidious, however, is that I'm even seeing it repeated by people who are generally on the left and who are in favor of COVID restrictions, who are not anti-CDC.
Dr. Fauci admitted something major in an interview this week, and I really think that this is a giant scandal, but nobody's really talking about it. It's about the U.S. government's official advice on masks early on during the pandemic. Take a look.
This is Kulinski of the YouTube channel Secular Talk. We are more or less aligned when it comes to politics, with both of us leaning left, and on our opinions on COVID restrictions, which we are generally both in favor of. However, I'm making this video as a response to him instead of your more typical MAGA conspiracy theorist for two reasons. One, because I think that Kyle operates in good faith and is the type of person to retract his statement if it can be shown to be wrong. Second, and more importantly, is that by making this response to someone who has similar politics to me, I want to make this an issue of media literacy and fact-checking, not partisan political divisions. Kyle then plays a clip from an interview that Dr. Fauci did in mid-June of 2020. We will watch this clip for ourselves in a bit, but first, let's see how Kyle interpreted this clip.
Yeah, but if you guys had just said that from the beginning, then nobody would be mad at you. But you didn't say that. There was this period where everybody was like, oh no, masks don't even help curb the spread of it. They actually were making arguments that actually, no, wearing masks doesn't do that. I don't know how else to say this. They were lying to us. That's a lie. That's not true. It does cut the spread. But instead of saying, hey, we need this for the frontline workers, in which case everybody would understand, or at least some percentage of the population would understand, and there would be enough masks for the frontline workers, they said masks don't work. Guys, you got to understand something. It's stuff like this that leads to a crisis in credibility for governments. And rightfully so. But this is an issue where people thought there was some more trust with medical experts within the government. Like, okay, they're medical experts. What are they going to do? They're not going to tell us the truth? Why wouldn't they tell us the truth? What's their incentive to not tell us the truth? Well, apparently, in this case, they were trying to protect the frontline workers, but they didn't think it through well enough, and so they lied about masks, and now they lose all credibility. Because now, the next thing you tell me about the virus that seems questionable, even me, I'm going to go, I don't know if that's true. Like, I have to take everything they say with a grain of salt now, because that was such a brazen lie. I can't accept a word you say at face value anymore. I want to be able to accept words you say from the medical community at face value, no questions asked. You're the experts. I'm an idiot. This is where I get my advice from. I want that to be the case. But when you lied to me about something as big as masks not working, now I got to take everything you say with a grain of salt because that's the only rational approach. So they destroyed their credibility. And that's damaging.
This right here is the misinformation I will debunk. Essentially, the claim is that Dr. Fauci and the CDC deliberately lied to the public by telling everyone that masks don't work. Even worse, they told this lie because they secretly wanted to make sure there would be enough masks left over for healthcare workers. Instead of being honest with the public and telling them that they needed to preserve enough masks for healthcare workers, they lied to the public with the message that masks don't work to discourage them from buying them up. They endangered the public for what they believed was the greater good. A noble lie. At least, that's the accusation that I've been hearing all over the place.
Why hasn't Fauci been fired yet? He's admitted to lying at times for noble reasons. Later, after he began urging government leaders to start mandating masks, he claimed that he wasn't backpedaling on his earlier statement. He just wanted to spare the few masks we had for frontline workers. A noble lie.
So what he's telling you is that he's a liar. And that he lied to Americans about the coronavirus on purpose so that you would be less safe from it. Because he had what he believed was a higher purpose.
But is that what really happened? Is that really what Fauci admitted in this interview? Let's watch it for ourselves and see.
Dr. Fauci, I want to ask you specifically about masks. So I want to ask you specifically, can you define for people what the role of masks is? Why were we told later in the spring to wear them when we initially were told not to?
Masks are not 100% protective. However, they certainly are better than not wearing a mask. both to prevent you, if you happen to be a person who maybe feels well but has an asymptomatic infection that you don't even know about, to prevent you from infecting someone else. But also, it can protect to a certain degree, not 100%. A mask is not 100% protective, but it does give you some protection. So you shouldn't discount that. Now, getting back to your first question, which was what about a month or so or 2 or 3 ago when people were saying you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed. So there was not enthusiasm about going out and everybody buying a mask or getting a mask. We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it. Now we have masks. We know that you don't need an N95 if you're a person, ordinary person in the street. We also know that simple cloth coverings that many people have can work as well as a mask in many cases. So right now, unequivocally, the recommendation is when you're out there, keep the distance physically and wear a mask. So although there appeared to be some contradiction of you were saying this then and why you're saying this now, actually the circumstances have changed. That's the reason why.
Now, I'm sure that there are many of you watching this who are scratching your heads right now. How am I possibly going to defend this? Didn't we just watch Fauci admit what he's being accused of admitting? Now, this is where we have to be careful. Fauci didn't admit to any lies in this clip. The reason why people get the impression that he did is because of the last point that he made. People are interpreting this as Fauci admitting that he lied about mask efficacy to preserve masks, but that's not what he indicated there at all. That is how you would interpret it, however, if you hold two background beliefs. First, you'd have to believe that Fauci/the CDC told people that masks do not work. Second is that you'd have to believe that Fauci and the CDC did not tell the public that they were trying to save masks for healthcare workers, that they kept this a secret. But are these two claims true? Investigating this question is what will determine whether or not Fauci really admitted to lying here. So, let's begin. First, did Fauci and the CDC really keep it a secret that they were trying to save masks for healthcare workers? Investigating this question is rather straightforward. All we have to do is look at statements that Fauci made early on, such as in this 60 Minutes interview from March of 2020.
There's a lot of confusion among people and misinformation surrounding face masks. Can you discuss that?
The masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else. Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. There are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill. The people who, when you look at the films of foreign countries and you see 85% of the people wearing masks, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not against it. If you want to do it, that's fine.
But it can lead to a shortage of masks.
Exactly. That's the point. It could lead to a shortage of masks for the people who really need it.
This interview is from when the CDC was still not recommending masks, and when asked why, Fauci clearly says that the concern is about saving enough masks for the people who need them. So as you can see, Fauci was publicly emphasizing the need to save mask supplies for healthcare providers and the ill. It was not kept a secret from the public. And it wasn't just Fauci saying this. This is an archived webpage from the CDC Guide to Preventing COVID from March of 2020, before they started recommending masks. As you can see, it says right there on the webpage, face masks may be in short supply and should be saved for caregivers. It was right there for everyone to see. What this shows is that back when face masks were not being recommended for the general public, Fauci and the CDC were completely transparent about telling the public that they were concerned about there being enough mask supplies for healthcare workers and the sick. This was never a secret, and it was never hidden from the public. So when certain online commentators said,
the Surgeon General and the U.S. government were saying, don't wear a mask, not because we need these critical supplies for our frontline healthcare workers, which would have been that, Like, yes,
Fine. People
tell
would
us
have
that.
listened
People would
Yeah.
have listened.
But instead of saying, hey, we need this for the frontline workers, in which case everybody would understand, or at least some percentage of the population would understand, and there would be enough masks for the frontline workers, they said masks don't work.
You know what? If they had just been honest with Americans and said, hey, please don't buy a mask right now. We need the masks, all the professional masks for professionals. Fine.
Right.
Who would not have done that? I
Right.
would have done it. So would have millions of other Americans.
Right.
The fact is that Fauci and the CDC did exactly that. They publicly and repeatedly told the public that mask supplies should be saved for healthcare workers and the ill. And yet, for some reason, Kyle and many others have continued under this belief. So that's one down. Next up is the claim that Fauci and the CDC told the public that masks do not work. First, let's remember that when the CDC began recommending for everyone to wear a mask, the rationale was, and continues to be, that regular cloth masks are effective in preventing the spread of the virus from an infected person to someone else. So once again, let's look at the statements made by Fauci and the CDC from before the mask recommendation. Again, we have the 60 Minutes interview from March to look at.
There's a lot of confusion among people and misinformation surrounding face masks. Can you discuss that?
The masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else.
Now, let's look again at the early CDC guidance from March, before they recommended that everyone wear masks. Here we have this section, simply titled, Wear a Face Mask If You Are Sick. It goes on to say that people who are sick should wear a mask whenever they are around other people, and that the people caring for them should wear masks as well. And for good measure, I found this interview that Fauci did all the way back in February of 2020, when there were only 15 recorded COVID patients. In this interview, Fauci claimed that the flu was more of a risk, and that the novel coronavirus is not an immediate threat to people in the United States, a statement which certainly has not aged well. However, Fauci also says this, quote, I think there's this misperception that wearing a mask, even if you were in an area where there was transmission, is going to absolutely protect you. A mask is more appropriate for someone who is infected to prevent them from infecting someone else. So once you hear these statements, it is clear that Fauci and the CDC never said that masks straight up do not work. What they did say is that masks are mostly effective at preventing someone who is already infected from passing the virus to someone else. So the reason why the CDC later began recommending that everyone wear the mask is because the data began indicating that people can be infected and spread the virus even before they show symptoms. And in April of 2020, when masks began to be recommended for everyone, this was exactly the rationale that was posted on the updated CDC guideline page. Also, notice that even after the CDC began recommending masks to everyone, they still continue to tell people to only use regular cloth masks and to save medical-grade masks for healthcare workers. So, contrary to what many people are saying, Fauci and the CDC have never said that masks do not work. Period. To be fair though, this misconception is much more understandable than the previous one. The media, when formulating their headlines or picking out a few choice quotes for social media, will pick out the quotes that they think are the most important. And when the average person hears Fauci say,
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask.
and they don't also hear the part where he says,
The masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else.
it's easy to understand why the average person would come to the belief that Fauci and the CDC are saying that masks simply do not work. Okay, so let's summarize what we've seen. The claim that we are investigating is whether or not Dr. Fauci and the CDC lied to the American public about mask efficacy for the hidden purpose of making sure that there were enough masks for healthcare workers. What we have seen using primary sources is 1. That Fauci and the CDC have been completely transparent and clear to the public from the very beginning that they did not want everyone buying up masks so that healthcare workers and the sick would have enough masks left over. At no point was this information hidden from the public. This was not a secret whatsoever. Second, we've seen that the messaging about the usefulness of masks, that they are most useful in preventing the wearer from spreading the virus, has been consistent both before and after the CDC recommended mask wearing to the general public. It is true that the CDC did not recommend that the general public wear masks early on, and it is true that this is a terrible mistake. This, however, is completely different from the CDC knowingly lying to and endangering the public for the hidden purpose of protecting a select group of people. And yes, the difference here is very important. One is an error that was the result of insufficient information that was then corrected as new information was made available. The other is a cynical, dangerous deception that likely resulted in unnecessary deaths. One depicts an organization that may be slow, but fundamentally bases its decisions on science. The other depicts a Machiavellian government organization that is happy to endanger the lives of regular people to protect the few. That is the difference between the truth and the misinformation in this instance. And those who have and continue to spread this lie are, intentionally or not, helping bad faith actors erode trust and expertise in this country and foster an environment that allows dangerous misinformation to spread. To those of you who are just genuinely mistaken, we know better now. Please stop. So that's the fact-checking portion of the video. I'd say that the fact-checking in this case was rather straightforward. There's a claim going around, and I simply found and presented the information that disproved it. Simple. But if you still feel like watching, I'd like to devote this next part of the video to a bit of media analysis. If disproving this claim was so straightforward, why did it spread so far and wide? And why is this claim being propagated even by those who are not conspiracy theorists, or anti-lockdown, or anti-vax activists? And why is it being spread even by those who make a really big deal out of being objective and honest? Well, there are several factors that I can see. First of all, Fauci and the CDC should have been much better at communicating. They should have avoided making statements like,
right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
Knowing how a soundbite like that can be misconstrued. The media is also partly to blame here. In trying to come up with short, easily digestible headlines, they very often only showed the quotes where Fauci and others would say things like, masks do not provide perfect protection. You would only see Fauci say the other part, that
the masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else.
If you bother to read the whole article or watch the whole interview, which we know that most people won't do. In their attempts to pick and choose the most important quotes to share with the public, the media ended up cutting out very important context and ended up spreading the misconception that Fauci and the CDC were saying that masks do not work, confusing the public and giving ammunition to conspiracy theorists who want to portray public health measures as arbitrary or based on lies. Like I said earlier, these sorts of reasons are why I have a hard time blaming the average person for coming away with these kinds of misconceptions. But I'm much less tolerant when this misinformation is being propagated by media personalities who purport to be objective, whose job it is to be informed. Again, I'm not talking about QAnon-style conspiracy theorists here. I'm talking about rather prominent online commentators who sell themselves as being anti-establishment, being honest and objective, above the petty tribalism that dominates the mainstream media. In these cases, I actually don't think it's a case of being simply misinformed. I think there's something more sinister happening here, and it might not even be on purpose. Let me explain. A lot of new media types brand themselves in opposition to the traditional mainstream media, your Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC types. Of course, they often rightly point out the many faults of the mainstream media, their biases, their elitism, their unprincipled partisanship, etc. Of course, to fight back against this, new media commentators will sell themselves as being objective, principled, and anti-establishment in contrast. But how does someone convince others that they're objective and principled? Well, a good way to do that is to run stories and make arguments that seem to be unfavorable to, quote-unquote, your side. For example, if you're apparently on the left, this means that you should run lots of segments where you criticize the left and praise the right. People are often tribalistic, and we are biased in a way that makes us weigh arguments and information that helps our side more heavily than information that helps the other side. This is a cognitive bias known as confirmation bias, and it takes conscious effort not to fall victim to it. So when we see someone who is apparently on one side of the political aisle criticize their own side and praise the other, we see it as a sign that they are able to rise above these primitive instincts and instead act on carefully considered principles. Now, obviously, this normally isn't a bad thing, but when you have an online audience and a persona built around the appearance of objectivity, this creates the danger of walking into a different type of cognitive bias. I'm not sure if this has a name yet, so let me come up with my own name for it. I love a good oxymoron, so let's call it the objectivity bias. The objectivity bias happens when an excessive desire to appear or feel objective leads you to enact a sort of reverse confirmation bias, when you become more charitable towards ideas that you would be expected to oppose, and fact-check stories and arguments from the other side less carefully than you would fact-check your own side, believing that this makes you more objective, when in reality, objectivity means weighing arguments from both sides the same way. I believe that this is the reason why these channels got this story so wrong. I believe that, in this case, the opportunity to appear objective and anti-establishment was more important than the fact-checking. A few lines in their videos give this away.
I really think that this is a giant scandal, but nobody's really talking about it.
We weren't telling the truth.
Nobody's paying attention.
We were lying to you.
Yeah.
First are the reminders that no one else is going to talk about this. This, of course, is the anti-establishment portion of the posturing, which allows you to present yourself as brave, renegade truth-tellers, one of the few who is willing to bring you the truth, unlike the mainstream media, which actively works to protect the establishment instead of informing you. Then we have this.
It's stuff like this that leads to a crisis in credibility for governments, and rightfully so. There are plenty of actual COVID-19 conspiracy theories that are like, oh, you know, it's total BS and they're totally inflating the death numbers and whatnot. There's a lot of those kind of conspiracies, and it's like, okay, they're wrong, but at the same time, I can't blame them for not believing what the government says because the government's lied a million times.
And how many people are still not wearing masks because of that early indication that they didn't work? And so that was part of what fed this whole like culture war, wear a mask, not wear a mask thing. If everyone had been honest and upfront and on the same page, then you may have more compliance from people at this point when we do know that this is actually something that's really important.
Who knows, right? Like when Fauci says something,
not good. The numbers aren't good.
I don't know if I trust him anymore.
This is the objectivity portion of the posturing. These are commentators who are not anti-lockdown and who agree with many of the COVID restrictions that have been put in place. But because they covered this story in this way, they get to go out of their way to say that while they mostly trust medical authorities, they can totally understand why others wouldn't. By seemingly acknowledging a valid point on their opposition side and accepting their viewpoint as apparently being rooted in facts, they get to portray themselves as being fair and open-minded. Above petty tribalism. They're fair. They're objective. Now, I can imagine that some would say that what I'm saying here is unfair. Am I claiming to know what's going on in other people's heads? How can I possibly do that? Well, I think I have some evidence that leads credence to my analysis, and it has to do with the selective circumstances in which they choose to trust the CDC. Let's recall the reaction these commentators had to Fauci apparently lying about masks.
I have to take everything they say with a grain of salt now because that was such a brazen lie that it's like, I can't accept a word you say at face value anymore.
There is. Who knows, right? Like when Fauci says something,
good. The numbers aren't good.
I don't know if I trust him anymore.
Because of the completely cynical lie they believe came from Fauci and the CDC, they now doubt everything that comes out of their mouths. After all, if they're willing to lie about masks, what else would they be willing to lie about? Months later, however, in early 2021, Robert Redfield, who was the director of the CDC in 2020, made some public statements that caught a lot of attention.
Dr. Robert Redfield, the former CDC director, is speaking out for the first time, saying publicly where he believes the coronavirus that caused the pandemic came from.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out.
That's right. The former director of the CDC came out to say that he believes that the coronavirus came from a lab. What's interesting to me is how our anti-establishment commentators reacted to this story.
This is surprising. This is a bombshell from the former CDC head. He goes on CNN, the most establishment of every outlet, to say something shocking about the origins of COVID-19.
If I was to guess...
I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, so whatever commentary I give on this, you have to put an asterisk by it and say, this is a regular Joe Schmo moron. So I just want to make that clear. Having said that, this segment convinced me. To the point where I'm like, 80% on the side of, nah, this came from the lab. There you go. I mean, former CDC head saying, I think it came from a virology lab in Wuhan. That's a huge deal.
But among the chief villains in this story is the media, which after Trump and many of his officials floated that theory nearly a year ago, decided that even entertaining the idea of the lab leak itself would validate something Trump said, and therefore invented an entire narrative about how blaming China for the release of this pandemic is racism. And after a year of posturing among everyone, someone with knowledge is actually speaking out in an extraordinary interview. Former CDC Director Robert Redfield, who served as director of that organization from 2018 until January 20th, told CNN's Sanjay Gupta in a special on coronavirus he believes the virus originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That is an extraordinary claim. Dr. Redfield is careful there to say it's just his opinion, but he's someone who would know.
Hey, wait a second. I thought you had to doubt everything that these public health officials say because of the mask lie. Why does the fact that Redfield is the former director of the CDC suddenly make him more credible and worth listening to? Well, one might reply, Robert Redfield is one of the good ones. He wasn't going out there and telling lies about mask efficacy like Fauci and the others were. To that, I would simply respond with this video.
You are the 18th Director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and Administrator of the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And in your capacity, could you help me to answer a few questions that I frequently get asked? Should people be stocking up on cleaning supplies?
No.
Should you wear a mask if you're healthy?
No.
And sir, is there anything else that I should have asked you that's a regular, everyday person kind of question?
The one comment I would make, because I do see people feeling a need to go buy masks. And I would ask them, and some people scoff at me when I say this, we need to make sure those N95 masks are available for the doctors and nurses that are going to be taking care of individuals that have this illness. And it really does displease me to find people going out. There's no role for these masks in the community. These masks need to be prioritized for healthcare professionals that, as part of their job, are taking care of individuals and/or individuals who have this virus and are in home isolation or home quarantine for those family members. So I'd like to have the prioritize the uses that we recommend and get people to realize that that's where these masks need to be reserved for.
Thank you.
That's Robert Redfield giving everyone the same advice that you called Fauci a liar for. If saying that made Fauci untrustworthy, then so is Redfield. So I ask again, why do these commentators think that the CDC is untrustworthy in one instance and suddenly very trustworthy in another? Well, I have an educated guess. Here are some statements that our commentators made in their segments about Robert Redfield.
I hesitated before bringing this story to you, but if you can't report on this when it's clear experts making this proclamation, then you can never report on it. So, I mean, this video will probably be demonetized and, could be viewed as promotion of an extremist position or whatever, but I got to tell you the truth.
But among the chief villains in this story is the media, which after Trump and many of his officials floated that theory nearly a year ago, decided that even entertaining the idea of the lab leak itself would validate something Trump said, and therefore invented an entire narrative about how blaming China for the release of this pandemic is racism. It is not a debunked theory that coronavirus escaped from a Chinese virology lab, no matter how much the media may want you to think otherwise. It is a legitimate question and a form of scientific inquiry, and the effort to erase possible Chinese complicity is a direct effort by our media to cover for our main geopolitical rival, all in the name of a fake racialized narrative, and ultimately to hurt the mean orange man, Donald Trump. Do not be gaslit into thinking otherwise.
And there you have it. In the case of Fauci, calling him a liar seemingly put you in opposition to the establishment and the mainstream media. Covering that story made it seem like you were pointing out a truth that no one in the mainstream media was willing to touch. In the case of Redfield, holding him up as a credible expert allowed you to positively report on the lab leak hypothesis, while once again reminding everyone that the mainstream media is trying to suppress this topic and keep the truth from the public. The answer to whether or not public health experts are credible or not is rather fluid here. The only thing that stays the same is the desire to show your audience how much better you are than the mainstream media, and how willing you are to go against this safe establishment narrative. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that these commentators deliberately got this story wrong just to cynically project their personal brands. In this case, I think these guys simply failed to do the necessary fact-checking, without the intent to deceive. But the question is why they failed to fact-check on this particular story, and my explanation is that it just worked too well for them. Reporting this particular story incorrectly in this way happened to fit right into the personal brands that they derive much of their appeal and fan base from. Whether they were conscious of it or not, I think that their enthusiasm for signaling these particular virtues got the better of them, and so they jumped on the chance to do this story without checking everything like they should have. The opportunity to report a story about a government official deliberately spreading a manipulative lie and endangering the public for what they thought was the greater good, and being one of the only ones to do it, was just too juicy to let go. I want to be clear that this video is not about hating or bashing on these particular commentators. We're all susceptible to cognitive biases, and while I don't feel so positively about Crystal and Sagar, or the other folks mentioned here, I generally like Kyle, and I appreciate a lot of the work he does, so I'm not trying to get anyone to stop watching him based on this mistake alone. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is because this is a microcosm of a tendency that I've been seeing much more of lately in the world of online commentary, which is the replacement of real research and analysis with just pure performance and aesthetics. And this is especially true in circles that like to spread conspiracy theories and misinformation. Misinformation that is successful at spreading is never boring. It's never stuff like claiming that a water molecule has one hydrogen atom instead of two. Misinformation that is successful at spreading is successful because it is fun to believe and repeat. It is fun to believe that you are one of the few people who are open-minded and brave enough and smart enough to find out the real truth, while everyone else is just a sheeple. It's fun to believe that you're a principled and objective commentator who is willing to bring your audience the truth that no one else is talking about. And you know what? You might actually be principled and objective most of the time, but the way you stay that way is by doing the work, and not just posturing. Finally, to end with, I want to be very clear that nothing I say in this video should be construed as an unconditional defense of the mainstream media, or even of the CDC, or any other government agency. Just like other kinds of institutions, there's a lot of legitimate criticism to be made about them, and in fact, I articulated some of these criticisms in this very video. So, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Don't confuse aesthetics with objectivity, and have a wonderful day. And now, I'd like to sincerely thank all of my patrons who have stuck by me this whole time. Finite Difference, Frank Moraes, Posty, Anthony Ha, Akbash Akita, Anime Titty Fan, Aramat, David Lamb, Elizabeth, Jack King Spooner, Milquetoast, Nix and Checkers, Red Wing, Sovereign Snake, The Ufio Answer, David Fuller, Frantic Atlantic, I Forgot My Name, Christian Nygaard, Reese Iyer, Sina, Streeter Sweeper, Suga and Stan. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you all next time.